All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Amanda Perry. I'm the Executive Director for the NACBS. And I appreciate you all taking the time out of the end of the semester chaos for many of you to join us to hear more about broadcasting apartheid. I am going to briefly introduce our guests today, and then I will turn it over to them. They are going to have a sort of informal discussion, and there will be time for Q&A at the end. So when we open it up to Q&A, please raise your Zoom hand with the react emoji or reaction button, and then we will know that you've got a question. So we are joined today by Tal Zalmanovich, who is a historian of media and modern Britain and the author of the recent book, which we're going to be hearing about today, Broadcasting Apartheid, British Television and the Anti-Apartheid Campaign, 1950 to 1990, published by OUP in 2025. She earned her PhD at Rutgers University after a career in journalism and has held positions at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and the University of Haifa. Her work appears in journals such as Critical Arts, Safundi, the Journal of South African and American Studies, and Postcolonial Studies. Her research has received support from the ERC grant Apartheid, A Global Itinerary, and the Burn Bussey Marconi Visiting Fellowship at the Bodleian Library, Oxford. So welcome to Tal. And she is going to be joined today in conversation by Rachel Sandwell, who is Assistant Professor of History at Cornell University. Her work focuses on the intellectual and social history of African decolonization, with a particular interest in women and gender politics. Her first book, National Liberation and the Political Life of Exile, looks at everyday life within the exiled African National Congress of South Africa, the ANC, and examines the intersections of politics, familial intimacies, and nation-making that unfolded as the ANC tried to make its way home to South Africa. So I hope you will all join me in welcoming Tal and Rachel today, and I will turn it over to Rachel.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks so much for being here. And yeah, thank you very much to Amanda for the invitation and to Tal for writing this great book, which I'm so thrilled to discuss. So it's wonderful to be here. So basically for the audience, Tal and I will chat for about half an hour and then turn it over to you for more discussion and questions. I'm very much coming from a South Africanist background, so no doubt some of you who are more in the British milieu have some more specific questions about that. So Tal, you've written this wonderful account of struggles between South Africa, really the South African state and its representatives, and the anti-apartheid movement in Britain, and to some extent British civil society over apartheid's representation. Right, you draw our attention throughout this book to diplomatic and personal interventions and struggles over reporting apartheid. But intriguingly, you don't focus just on reporting apartheid, but you draw us into the realm of popular representation through discussing some really kind of powerful, we could say like successful representations of apartheid, and then other quite awkward or kind of failed representations of apartheid in British popular culture. Um, so overall and throughout, you left me really convinced of the utility of reading TV and apartheid together. And I was actually so struck by this point that I think you make throughout, or that you raise in the introduction and support throughout, of the fact that television as a medium really arose and became this mass popular medium at the time of apartheid and the anti-apartheid struggle. And you really pitched them as very combined, which I think works. I was totally persuaded, and I was struck that, of course, I've thought a lot about apartheid on TV. I've used kind of televisual representations of apartheid in my teaching, but I hadn't before thought about how coterminous those two things were, the development of TV as a popular medium and apartheid and anti-apartheid. So I wanted to ask you to just begin by telling us the story of this project. How did you come to it? And kind of almost like which came first for you, an interest in the anti-apartheid movement, an interest in TV? Did you see them as intertwined from the beginning? And just, yeah, how did you get to this great analysis and this great project?
Thank you, Rachel, for this really kind and generous introduction of the book, and thank you, Amanda, for inviting us to have this conversation. And thank you, everyone, for being here. The last time I presented at the NACBS conference was actually in 2017 when I presented the first findings that became this book. So it's like really nice to bring it back to you again, this time as a completed project. As for the origins of this project, my book is actually dedicated to the precariat. And I think that that might be the material, a reality that grounds this project. I wrote my thesis about television sitcom comedies in Britain and the creation of post-war or post-imperial Britain. But a couple of years after finishing that project, I was invited to be part of a European Research Council project as a postdoctoral researcher. The project itself was about the global cultural, political, ideological life, maybe of the concept of apartheid. But at the time, I didn't know very much about South Africa, and I knew very little about apartheid. And I was brought as the, historian of Britain and of media. And so I was asked to contribute something from my field of expertise. So this is about the precariat part of this project. As for the substance of it, um, as I was getting acquainted with South African history, it became clear to me that I would like to write something about the role of broadcast media in the struggle. As you mentioned before, television as a cultural form really rises in the post-war era, and I thought that the two things together are an interesting sort of axis to work with. Um, and I found that although there was a lot of writing about the textual culture of anti-apartheid and the academic production and memoirs and the literary production of apartheid and anti-apartheid and the visual culture of the anti-apartheid struggle, there was really very little about the media and broadcast media more specifically. So in one of my very, very first research ventures into the archives at the Bodleian Library, I started reading Trevor Huddleston's papers. This made a lot of sense since he was the president of the British anti-apartheid movement in Britain. He was one of the founders. He was a real media presence both in South Africa and later on in Britain. So it was the logical place to look for some kind of evidence about the media strategy of this nascent grassroots movement. Um, and as I was looking through his papers, I came across Box 39. Box 39 is actually a box that is full of letters from the British public to Huddleston following a televised debate between him and Enoch Powell, the notorious conservative politician. This was a debate that took place on ITV in kind of a front of a live audience in a studio. It was recorded in towards the end of 1969, so really at this very, very heated moment of discussions about immigration and racism in Britain. So this studio debate brought these two very intense personalities to television to debate um, this very heated topic. And the box at the Bodleian was full of responses of viewers who felt the need to respond. The debate moved them so much that they actually ran to put their thoughts on paper. Some of them were obviously in support of Huddleston, other disapproved of him. Many people were very upset by what they called his tendency to induce imperial guilt and shame. Others felt very comforted by his presence, by his defense of a Britain that could view non-whites as part of its national community. And so was amazed, I think, both by the profusion of letters, but also by the intensity of emotion that this debate, which was actually a very intellectual debate, not a very emotional one even, had induced in so many viewers. And with time, I started thinking about this debate as a form of political participation. as a form of political participation that is very, I think, characteristic of the post-war moment, when we have this medium, when we have this ability of bringing viewers into a larger debate without being in, in in the city hall or without being in the city square. And it made me think about the screen, about television as an extension of the public sphere. In that way, I thought it was an interesting way to think about grassroots activism in the post-war moment. So that's the origin of this project.
Oh, that's a great answer. Thank you so much. You covered so much there. I want to pull out a few strands. I mean, I was really struck by your, maybe I could say, two thematic elements. Number one, how well throughout this book you weave these serious considerations of race and racism in Britain and this domestic debate, and you make it very clear that the conversation about apartheid and South Africa and kind of the space South Africa occupied in popular consciousness in Britain really couldn't be untangled from that. And the Huddleston Powell debate, which I will admit I didn't know about. I was so struck to read your account of that. And on the one hand, it's I don't know, it's in a sense perhaps profoundly depressing to read about a moment when people could actually have serious kind of intellectual conversations on television, because that ship has sailed. On the other hand, yeah, I think you treat it so well in considering Huddleston's kind of ambivalent positionality, right? His real stand for rights, his absolute, I think, personal devotion to the cause of Black freedom in South Africa and racial justice in Britain, and at the same time, as you point out, his own kind of position of privilege. So I'll ask you one question, which we talked about in a minute, about Huddleston. So he's someone I'm very interested in as well. He's someone who I'm working on a biography of a woman an American, who became connected to South African struggles via meeting Huddleston, sort of via Huddleston's introduction in South Africa in the 50s. So I have also read about him, although not as thoroughly and with as rich archival detail as you yet. But I wanted to ask you this question, thinking about his ambivalence. It's a little beside the South African question, but maybe a more methodological question of how we deal with difficult subjects. So, as you and I talked about beforehand, Huddleston was, I think, on two occasions accused of childhood sexual abuse. And the question, I think, for historians is like, how do we deal with that, right? How do we deal with an awkward feature of our central characters, but especially where it's like it's an awkward feature that's not really central to the story, right? And there have been great South African feminist conversations about this lately too, about kind of what does it mean to, instead of kind of treating the personal as inevitably subject to or part of the biographical experience, what does it mean to preserve a subject's privacy? When do we choose to emphasize privacy and boundaries? When do we sort of decide to surface difficult knowledge? I'm thinking here of the feminist critiques of Johnny Steinberg's Winnie and Nelson book, which many South African feminists felt was sort of excessively prurient and unnecessary. So how, and this is, I ask you because I don't know what I would do myself in writing about Huddleston. So how did you, as you say, you treat this question very well in a footnote, but how did you come to that decision? What did you kind of balance in deciding how to talk about these allegations against Huddleston in relation to his important public persona, which you, I think, dissect so well?
So Huddleston was, of course, for me, a very important protagonist for this story because he's one of the people that moves my story from South Africa to Britain. With the crackdown on dissent in the late 50s, early 1960s, so many of the activists are forced out of South Africa into exile. Huddleston already in 1955, 1956 is already threatened that he has to leave South Africa, and actually his order, the Community of the Resurrection, pulls him out. It's not even his decision, and for years later, he is very upset about this move. And in a way, he has to find a new place for himself, from being a witness to injustice to being an advocate, sort of to injustice that is happening somewhere else. And so with him also being the president of the anti-apartheid movement in Britain, it was impossible to ignore him, nor did I want to ignore him. So I guess the first decision was that I will tell his story. The second decision was, of course, to read anything I can about Hadelson and also about these accusations. At the National Archives, there are some of the reports of the British Met Police, of the policemen who interview him. Hadelson never denied these accusations, which again were about two brothers in London during his time in Hackney. So this has nothing to do with his time in South Africa. It has everything to do about the time in London. And again, he's a very contested figure. When he arrives to Hackney, there are many people that are unhappy about it. His involvement in anti-racism campaigns and speaking against Harrelson in quite a few occasions, and there's a few public disputes between them, which lead to this televised debate later on. But he's a controversial figure. So I did read this report. A lot of the files are actually closed till 2070. So there's a lot that we can't read about. Some of the biographers write about it as well. And at the end of the day, I felt that in Broadcasting Apartheid, I write about Huddleston as a public figure, as a communicator, as the leader of an anti-apartheid campaign. And I'm not as interested in him as a person per se. So I do write about his vanity. I do think with contemporaries about his use of media and why is he so interested in media, how much of it is vain and glory, as some say, and how much is really utilitarian, or maybe a reflection of him being in the middle of so many networks, cultural networks, and networks of celebrities of the time. So I think that for me, I felt that my analysis of his work in the anti-apartheid campaign would not change knowing this information, that it doesn't have bearing on the campaign itself or about the decisions around it. Um, I don't know if that's the right decision. And of course, that's why there is the footnote referring readers to all this information and the location in the archives and suggesting that if somebody is interested to know more, it is available. Uh, but I felt that it didn't move my story forward, that it didn't have bearing on the campaign or on the way that it was conducted. But of course, during question times, I'd be curious to hear if other people would think of treating this in a different way.
That's great. Thank you. I personally, but yeah, of course, it would be interesting to hear from others, but I think you dealt with it very well. And it does draw our attention to, this nuance, right? We're writing political history. Your work is very much a work of political history. And, how we draw the bounds around political figures is, always under negotiation. But I think you negotiated very well here with your kind of centering of Huddleston, but also of his ambivalence as regards the political questions that are central to your approach. Um, I have a more specific question, but a broader question. Maybe I'll go with the broader question first, which is about archives in general. So you've mentioned a little bit, you've mentioned Huddleston's papers at the Bodleian, you've mentioned the National Archives. I was certainly struck and really impressed in this project by, how you're ranging into archives that I think certainly Southern Africa focused scholars haven't looked at, that haven't really been engaged in studies of at least we could say South African exile or kind of the politics of anti-apartheid, so especially the BBC archives. And you do mention in your acknowledgments that those were some of your favorite archives to work in. So I would just love to hear about your archival approach in general, but then also about your kind of favorite archival moments, if there were particular moments that were kind of epiphanies for you or that really, you mentioned this amazing discovery of all these viewer responses to the Powell Huddleston debate, but if you had other kind of, yeah, key archival thrilling moments.
Um, I guess archives is why we do a lot of this. So that's always amazing to be able to spend time in various archives. And really, this project is built on different types of archives. So there's institutional ones, there's private ones, print focused, sort of text-based archives, and audio and visual archives. So I think to figure out how to work with each type of archive in a different way. And certainly the best is if I could layer them. So if I could put various things in conversation that weren't in conversation before, that was the best. The BBC archive is, first of all, I have to say, is under attack and is sort of threatened to be closed to the public. And so it's very sad that that's what's sort of they're thinking of monetizing it, and so even now it's a very opaque archive to work in because it doesn't have a digital index. You are totally dependent on the wonderful people who work there, the archivists, but it's not as if you can, research it the way maybe the National Archives that are so organized and sort of kind of very researcher facing. So you are assigned an archivist, and you could try out various keywords. So I would say something like South Africa or apartheid, and like give me anything that might have that on the cover. And so you're very dependent also on the creativity of the archivists there and kind of their generosity of spirit in the moment. Um, and in addition to that, it's a very institutional archive that, despite hoping every time that it will be kind of a more entertainment focused archive, but it's a working place archive. And so there is a lot of information about, producing a show. So the taxi that Huddleston was paid or not paid, and minutia like that sometimes don't amount to much. So it's wonderful if you are able to find there something that is more substantial. And for example, I was able to find two ends of a conversation. One of them at the National Archives with the Foreign and Commonwealth Wealth Office, where there was a discussion about the broadcasting of one of Panorama's 1957 programs. That was a special report where Robin Day of Panorama went to South Africa to cover one of the events in the country. And the South African government was displeased by the way that it thought that South Africa would be represented. And so their foreign affairs minister has a meeting with the Prime Minister, Howard Macmillan, to complain and to try and apply pressure on the BBC to stop this programming. From the side of the BBC archive, you could see the Director General writing and pushing back, talking about editorial independence, etc., etc. So for me, these two findings, of course, are great because they work together, but also because they demonstrate one of my main points of the book, that television is a real area of concern. It is a site of politics and struggle, and that the stakes are very high. They're high enough to reach the level of very high government on both sides. So it's not only that the South Africans are invested in it, but also the British government is willing to actually participate, to partake in this conversation about maybe putting limits on its own broadcaster.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And yeah, I think that's for me, I think a really resonant takeaway of this book, right, is the significance of struggles over representation and struggles over, when we talk about this all the time in our work, but here you really concretize it, right? Here we're literally government representatives kind of vying with journalists and journalists' particular commitments to show things a certain way, to do work that they felt was serious and credible, and the tensions that that occasioned, yeah, all these kind of rippling, diplomatic and institutional levels too, right? The institutional politics of the BBC as showing up in here are interesting and of course continue to be, subjects of major debate today. That's terrible that the BBC archives are under threat. That's really dismal news. And I think we face a moment where many archives are under threat, which is deeply alarming for the work that all of us do, but also for freedom and democracy more broadly, as I think your work shows. Maybe I'll ask one more question before we turn it over to the audience for questions. So we've talked about the kind of news and the sort of more officialized public representations or kind of formalized representations of apartheid. I was also so struck by these sort of theatrical or fictionalized representations of apartheid that you uncovered as well. So in particular, these really awkward sitcoms, right, which are sort of you describe so well, and actually you kind of make this great commentary about British humor and the kind of kind of proud nationalism of Britain's sort of sense of humor mentality. And then I think, describe quite well how these sitcoms or humorous episodes, which were intended or sort of pitched as pillorying apartheid or pitched as mocking apartheid, in fact, were deeply racist and sort of disturbing. So I wanted to hear about, yeah, your kind of viewership experience watching those, how it was to uncover them and how you decided to integrate them into the narrative, which I think packs such a rhetorical punch. And also, I was curious if you ever uncovered any discussion of those kind of particularly unfortunate representations at the time. Did people of the anti-apartheid movement comment on them? Did that stream of kind of public representation intersect at all with the more kind of organized politics of sort of efforts to represent apartheid?
Many questions here. Uh, Let me try and unpack this a bit. So, I think the first thing to say is that when I was thinking about this project, I wanted to replicate a bit the experience of watching television at the time. So, unlike the way we watch television today, I think it's useful to think about Raymond Williams's concept of flow. The kind of cultural theorist working in the 1970s and thinking about television. And when we think about a one channel, two channel kind of environment, which is hard for us to think today, but for many of the years of apartheid, at least until 1980, that's the reality in Britain, then with Channel 4. I mean, but still, as viewers, you would kind of switch on your TV as if you're opening a tap. And whatever came out came out, and then you would be watching, and maybe you started watching at 6 o'clock and there was a children's program, and then it would move to some kind of segment about nature, and then it would, there'd be some sports coverage, and you would flow from one kind of genre to the other. And so in that way, the book also flows between the genres because my contention is that the way that the British public learned about apartheid and learned about resistance to it was not only via sort of the news or current affairs, but the representation of both South Africa and apartheid South Africa was woven into these genre television as well. And one of the areas, as you mentioned, is comedy and various kind of comedy shows. Um, Comedy is always complicated in various ways because it works on different kinds of levels, and the decoding of it is always a big question. Here, stealing from Stuart Hall. And it's hard for us to understand or to kind of surmise what it is that the viewers are getting. Um, First, I wanted to highlight the fact that many of the comedies of the time were dealing with apartheid and were commenting on it and about South Africa. So we have Till Death Us Do Part, which in the United States maybe is more known as All in the Family. having a whole episode about that, or The Goodies. That's another sketch show, kind of a surrealist sketch show that it has a whole episode also about South Africa totally in blackface, extremely racist, very hard to to watch right now. And into sketches like in Spitting Image and etc. Um, the idea was to see how this kind of casual discussion of South Africa, what does that reveal as a way of thinking that these kind of representations tell us a lot about a more general perception of apartheid. But what I also found is that they tell us so much about the discussion of racism in Britain itself. And so many times, although we know or that the writers or the performers were, card-holding socialists or involved in anti-racist initiatives, etc., these representations are still highly racist and racialized. And so I thought it was interesting to uncover the tension both between the comic representation of apartheid and the critique of it, but also this kind of undercurrents of domestic racism that it highlights. And I didn't find people in the anti-apartheid movement commenting on it. Again, the archive of the movement is also more of an institutionalized archive. It's actually a very interesting archive that has just been created not very long ago by an amazing archivist at the Bodleian, Lucy McCann, that maybe some of you have come across, an archive that tells the story, I think, in some ways of what happens to a grassroots movement when it succeeds. So what happens to an office of activists, the moment that, apartheid ends, and there's all this kind of paper trail of the 40 odd years that they've been working. And now, how can you preserve this history? And Lucy really was spearheaded this amazing effort to turn these boxes full of papers and posters and leaflets and invitations and letters and requests and everything into a really live and accessible archive.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And yes, this question of kind of archiving these, in a sense, like very diffuse movement, right? Because the anti-apartheid movement was organized and yet also dispersed, scattered, localized. So capturing all those materials, the ephemera, is so necessary, but so challenging. So I thought now we could turn it over to the audience for questions. Perhaps you could raise your hand using the little hand raise function, or if you can't find it, just put on your camera and wave your physical hand and we'll see you. But yeah, so please go ahead. And actually, maybe briefly introduce yourself too. So Erica, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I know a lot of you, but Tal, I remember your talk in 2017, so it was a long time ago. Yeah, so this is a question in part. So I'm teaching a class right now on propaganda and the persuasion industries. It's a global class, and some of my students are here. So we are reading that book, Selling Apartheid. So I was wondering, Tal, if you could talk a little bit more about essentially how aware the anti-apartheid movement was of the global propaganda campaign of the South African state. And then one thing that struck me in reading that book, of course, is so much of it was hidden and not known, and it changes over time. But also, the different methods they use. But the book doesn't talk much about television, so it's kind of interesting. But also, television was so expensive if you're doing commercial television in particular. So I was wondering how the anti-apartheid movement literally would pay for, or could they pay to challenge that global movement? So more the kind of political economy of the anti-apartheid movement, if you could speak more about that.
So thank you. That's really a very important question. Of course, they didn't have money to pay for anything. So So they did not pay for ads in that way and ads on television. And also, my focus is Britain, and the television market is very different there. At least in 1980s, there's less of a commercial channels with ads on them. So the idea was to try and interest the press. And make yourself interesting. And, like we see today, for example, doing a reenactment of the Sharpeville massacre, kind of to commemorate the day. So that was an event that could bring out the press because it's interesting and it's colorful, quote unquote. So that was one thing. They did try to do, so the BBC at some point, I don't know if some of you have heard about this television initiative called, it was called something like Open Door, in which they would invite local groups, community groups, educational centers to pitch them an idea for a half-hour program. And the anti-apartheid movement really wanted to get a spot, but they couldn't do anything interesting enough. The BBC never, greenlit that. So that didn't work. The thing that worked best was the Mandela's birthday concert, which, until today is held up. It's one of these, most recognized media events of the time. So it was in 1988. It was celebrating Mandela's 70th birthday. He was still imprisoned, had not been seen since he was sent to Robben Island in 1964. It was not allowed to show his image, nor read his words, or let his voice be heard. And then they come up with this idea of a celebration, of a birthday concert, celebrating Mandela, but of course all political prisoners. And so it's a 10-hour extravaganza concert with the best musicians of the time and the greatest celebrities from, I don't know, Whoopi Goldberg and Whitney Houston and Desmond Tutu and, Tracy Chapman launches her career there, etc., etc. Over 600 million viewers around the world watch this concert, which is kind of the biggest thing that the anti-apartheid movement does in collaboration with the BBC. So they actually engage a production company that wants to keep it light and happy. The BBC wants to reach younger audiences, and music is seen as the way to do it. Plus, there is already in 1988 a wind of change in relation to the anti-apartheid movement. And it's an extremely successful event, which we know, at least from the membership numbers, that really jump following this event. So there's a lot of money because, as you said, it's a very expensive and kind of not easy to produce. But there's money from contributions and from ticket sales, rights sales, photography sales, merchandise, kind of the whole sort of commercial aspect of a movement that's kind of coming into its peak moment.
Great, thank you. That sounds fascinating. I can't wait to read the book. So thanks.
Thanks, Tal. And yeah, I was so struck by your really great kind of elucidation of the micropolitics of this delicate relationship between the BBC and the anti-apartheid movement, and kind of navigating the extent to which the event could be described as political. It's fascinating. I think we have a question from Paul Joseph.
Okay. Hi there. It's actually Nadia here.
Hi, Nadia. Nice to hear you.
Dad. I'll put the video on just to say hi for a sec. Or maybe no, don't worry about the video because I think we're blocked. So that's fine. Okay. Thank you so much, both of you. Nice to see you both. And I've been really enjoying the book. That's the first thing I need to say. So thank you, Tal, for that. And my dad really enjoyed the book. This isn't really a question, it's just a series of comments. I hope that's okay, Tal.
Sure.
So yeah, very, very interesting. We were both really impressed with it. There's just a couple of things that during your conversation that I just wanted to kind of give my take on, and it's just my take. And my dad and I have been kind of talking with the with the audio, with the mics off. In your conversation, you know, you were the term ambivalent came up about Huddleston, and I would say that he himself is not an ambivalent figure. I think has been ambivalence around him since those allegations, understandably, and in some of the things that you debate in the book about, you know, possibly his own vanity and his in, you know, as an individual, which is never far from any political kind of situation, and people are in the public eye, and you know, it kind of goes through everything really. But it was something that was discussed and tended to be in those years just following, you know, the end of apartheid, when these things were kind of coming much more into the public domain. That was the first thing. And I think I agree with Rachel that you know, that's a whole other story. So what you do is you really analyze what he was doing in terms of his work to support the anti-apartheid struggle, and you don't get diverted into a whole other kind of, you know, a quagmire really of what could be a very complicated discussion. So I think you did well to do that. But I think, yeah, so that was the first thing. The other couple of things that we were kind of, you know, commenting about here is that I understand. I mean, you referenced Raymond Williams, and I think he's a very important thinker in terms of this concept of flow. But I think, again, I haven't got a straw poll of all the different people in Britain and how they watch TV and how engaged they were. But certainly within the movement, and certainly in my friendship group at school, which wasn't made up of activists, little activists, there was a lot of discussion about those very comedies, those sitcoms. That was very live, and within those, there are a number of contradictions, what would seemingly be contradictions. So, for example, you know, in our family, we all knew what Love Thy Neighbor was. For those of you that don't know, it's a sitcom. It was a sitcom based on a black couple living next door to a white couple. The white couple are very racist, or at least the man is. The wife is a little bit more congenial and nice to the woman, but the black woman and the black man are portrayed as they're very objectified sexually. You know, there's all these kind of the usual stuff about, you know, the sexual prowess of the black man, the attractiveness of the black woman, the hang-ups of the white man. But even though we didn't watch it and yet we knew what it was, because my parents just thought, oh God, it's so terrible, it's so ridiculous. It wasn't banned in the sense that we weren't aware of it. There were lots of conversations, and not just in our household, about the nuances of that and what was really going on. And a lot of us were, even at our young age, very conscious of what was happening. And when I say contradictions, and it's the same actress, Nina Baden, and was also in a film that I absolutely love. My father loves it. It was made by a friend of his, and you talk about it and you mention it in passing, Jemima and Johnny and Jemima, and by Lionel Ngakani. And she's one of the actors in that film, and that film is a silent film. It's a wonderful film, and I've written some stuff about it and talked about it at festivals. And it shows that it tells us so many different things. About the popular culture and the kind of parts that Black people were, you know, limited to, but also what they were also able to do in other fields within film and TV that was more political, and interestingly without dialogue. So there are these contradictions. But that's against the backdrop of a complex society. Britain was complex. It was very racist. It was still very much about the empire. And yet there were many creative political people in this country driving a different alternative narrative. So I think it's not quite as simple as being able to say, well, there were these racist comedies and there were these kind of, you know, progressives around. I think there is some nuances to that, you know, would benefit from just generally amongst us all, not necessarily in your book, because there's so much you can do, but talk about some of those complexities. And again, even with, as you say, you described them as in the conversation as the kind of card-carrying socialists. You know, people were taking part in some of these comedies who themselves, Warren Mitchell, for example, was also, an anti-apartheid activist. He did lots of political work. And I think with comedies like things like that and Rising Damp and those sorts of comedies, there are different points of identification within them. And so some people will be laughing with the racist, some people will be laughing at the racist, some will be identifying with the Black characters, some will be identifying with the white. But as you say in your book, this is something that was being thrown out there. It was live, it was current, writers were responding to this kind of material. And how it lands is how it lands. I mean, it was not being presented like the panorama programs where this is a take, or in the interest of balance they were doing things. This was being played for laughs. It was popular TV. Some of it was highly offensive to many people. So, but there's still so much that can be dissected within that and analyzed. So I think I don't think people were necessarily passively just consuming this in terms of the flow, that Raymond Williams kind of thing. I think people are always critiquing it. Even if they're absorbing it, there'll be conversations at work, in the playground, about these very things. And I think they have stayed in our psyche long beyond the running of those programs. So there was there's so much that I could, so much of interest in your book that we could talk about. But my dad and I were just talking about those comedies and, remembering them. And people were in blackface, and sometimes it was it was obviously offensive. But there were these kind of contradictions, both within the writing and the casting and the production and the consumption of those particular types of programs. I'll be quiet now.
Thanks so much, Nadia. That was great. Those were great reflections. Tal, do you want to comment on the reflections?
No, well, Nadia and I have many conversations, so we keep commenting about these things. I'll just say about Lionel Nakakane that he's such an interesting character, and he really makes an appearance in the book in a different chapter, because he is an extremely political creator, and so many of the artists working at the time, exactly, they're holding these two ends of the stick, and it's interesting to and I in the chapter that is about drama, I try to flesh out a bit more these various paths that they take and how they navigate the different contexts in which they're active.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Maybe while people wait to formulate their questions, I have one for you about that very famous Brian Widlake interview of Nelson Mandela. And I was so struck by your chapter where you kind of dig up and describe for us how that interview came to happen. It was like very thrilling to read, actually, your account. It was like a page turner, because it was so thrilling how that interview was arranged. And I would say for me, it's, I've used that interview, I've shown that interview as recently as this past semester in class, but I never really thought about how it got organized. And it's, I think, a real sort of contribution of your book to remind us that these mediated representations that we use, that are still valuable teaching tools, that kind of speak across the gulf of time to show us these key moments, that those were, they took a lot of work to create. So in that case, I was very struck that it was key figures in the anti-apartheid underground in South Africa, or sort of semi-underground at that time, who made it happen. I was so struck that Ruth First, someone who I work on, who Susan Pennybecker here has also worked on, that Ruth First, herself a journalist, someone who then was active in London, as you write about, that she played a big role in, or at least a partial role in, arranging that interview. So I don't know if you wanted to say a little more. Did you set out to kind of uncover how that interview happened, or did you sort of happen upon it and realize it was a story to tell?
So because this project originated with Trevor Huddleston, a white Christian missionary working in South Africa, I was, I guess, concerned that I didn't want to, and the fact that the British anti-apartheid campaign was very white, many times very consciously so in its public facing, at least persona. So of course Nadia, Joseph and Paul and her mother were active, and there were many other activists in as well. But I wanted to give voice to the non-white activists that created this campaign. And so to move away from Huddleston and the things that or kind of the populations that he represented, although, as I said, he does get a considerable place in the book because uh, because he was the president of the movement. And so I really didn't want to start the book with him. I wanted to highlight the very savviness of a Black activist in South Africa. I also didn't want to completely, although this is a book about the British side of the campaign, I did want to anchor it in South Africa. And so it was important for me to find a sort of an anchoring point that would be in South Africa and led what could be better than by Nelson Mandela, that then becomes the face of the global movement. And so this very, very short interview, we have to say, so kind of what we have is a very short interview with Mandela that is part of a larger report that Brian Woodlake from ITV sent to do in South Africa. And being a former journalist, I guess I start every project with Googling the people and seeing if I can find any kind of maybe newspaper coverage or anything that any hints to their path. And I came across some of these interviews that Woodlake did later in life, just before he passed away, in which he does describe how this interview was put together. I think even in part of his, in the broadcast itself, he tells some of the story, but doesn't mention the name of the activists that then become extremely well known. Ruth First, of course, is one of them, but Ahmed Kathrada as well. He spends many years in prison with Mandela himself. He's one of the Riviona's trialist. And so kind of finding Wiglake's sort of testimony and learning how this interview came together, I think, yes, was a very kind of added a lot to the retelling of this story, but also to showing sort of or demonstrating the savviness of local activists. Especially because so many of them, I mean, sort of we're used to thinking, or I'm used to thinking maybe about Huddleston as at the center of this network of journalists and media personalities. But in his own network, there were so many journalists, so many amazing photographers, people working in Drum magazine, which was really a cultural force in Johannesburg at the time, displaying so many extremely talented Black writers and photographers and journalists doing very important investigative work. And so kind of going back and constructing the context of this interview was a way for me to at least start this story with, in South Africa with Black activists.
That's great. Thank you so much. Any last questions in our last 5 minutes?
If you don't mind, I'd love to ask a question. Tal, I'm wondering, having worked as a journalist, how that either informed or influenced how you approach the project, how you approach the sources, I'm wondering how that sort of impacted this.
So I think I mean, I was a print journalist, although I did work a bit in TV, kind of doing research. And I think as a person that loves and appreciates journalism and media, first of all, I thought of it as a space, as an important space, and as a extension of the public sphere, especially for this period. So I already, I think, came in with this bias, uh, so to speak, that this is a part of the story, not only sort of using the media, but journalists and the institutions behind them are part of our democracy, are part of the way we think about rights, we think about justice and social and political activism. Um, and so I was interested in looking into that because, again, I'm a believer in the power of the press and the importance of the press. And so I think that was a way to into this project. The other thing is, of course, the sources. As I mentioned, I always sort of am interested in how events are covered in the national press, in the letters to the editors, in any kind of way in which the press itself covers events. Television critics, I think of as important cultural commentators. So to me, it looks like an important space that should be also represented in our scholarship and in our archives.
Great. Well, I feel like that's a great place to end, a great note to end. Then Paul Joseph and Nadia also put a comment in about the wider environment of that Nelson Mandela concert, which is very interesting to read. But yeah, thanks, Tal, for all these great answers. And to everyone who hasn't had the chance to read the book yet, I recommend it strongly for anyone with interest in media and the anti-apartheid movement. So, or either or, because it covers both very well. So thank you so much.
And
Thank you,
thank you,
Rachel.
Rachel,
Thank you, everyone.
for being our discussant today. And thank you, Tal, so much for sharing this work with us. This is our penultimate event for the semester. We have one more event in our spring before we'll break for the summer, but then over the summer, we're going to be looking towards our fall schedule. So for anyone that's out there in the audience that might know of, someone who's got a book coming out, do encourage them to get in touch. But then in the meanwhile, I hope everyone here will join me in thanking Tal and Rachel for their time today. And we'll wrap it up there.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.